Hello and welcome again to Inside Geneva, and it's that time of year again. It's time for our journalists round table where we're going to look back at 2023 and dare to have a little peek forward at 2024, a risky business because I think this time last year there are certain things that have happened over the last 12 months that we couldn't predict. Joining me today I have Nick Cumming-Bruce, who writes for the New York Times, Emma Farge for Reuters, and our own Dorian Burkhalter for Swissinfo. I'm going to start by just asking each of you, before we go into all the events, things we didn't predict that happened this year, could you pick one kind of story, standout story that has really struck you, that will stay with you? Emma, I think I'll maybe start with you.
Sure. This year has felt like lurching from one catastrophe to another. We began the year with Pakistan, I think floods, through to Sudan, through to Morocco, through to Libya. Anyway, but I kind of measure my journalistic life in pre-Hamas-Israel conflict and post. And I've got to say, what has been happening with that conflict has stood out for me, and it's pretty much engulfed me. And it's been a very emotional story in a way that I haven't experienced, at least since I've been in Geneva. Certain moments I found it very difficult to actually keep my composure. One of those moments was when I saw the statement from Hamas saying that the Bibas family, who had been taken hostage in Gaza, had been killed. It's still not verified, but I'd interviewed family members 2 weeks before in Geneva, who were pleading for access to them, and that was a blow to the stomach. And I'm not the only one. You look at these organizations, a lot of people have lost staff there, and a moment stood out for me when Ravina Shamdasini, the spokesperson for the UN Rights Office, started almost breaking down on the podium, describing how staff in Gaza were having to choose between sleeping in their homes and potentially being crushed to death, and sleeping in the open and risking death from shrapnel in the conflict. So it's been personal for everyone, and it's been difficult for journalists to really navigate this information war and to navigate it with your composure.
Yeah, so. I think that's really true. I found that myself. I mean, I've been working out of Geneva for a long time, and a lot of people, especially some of my colleagues in London, say, that's a bit of a cushy number, Geneva. But actually, we're reading and listening horror on a regular basis. And I, like you, this one has hit me very much, very deeply. It's very hard to actually keep going back to it. Keep saying we should look at this, tell my editors we should look at this angle. Anyway, we will return a little bit, I think, to Gaza. I'm sure we will. But I will ask you, Dorian, over the last 12 months, you have a standout story.
Well, I mean, I'm afraid I'll have to talk about Gaza as well, because, I mean, I think it is a standout story, even though it isn't just one story. But I think it is indeed. I mean, I haven't been here a very long time, but last year we were hearing about terrible things in Ukraine as well, and hearing it from the humanitarian agencies here in Geneva. But I think maybe there was a bit more of a distance, I guess, between the things they were telling us, and I mean, they were removed, I guess, a bit more from the civilian suffering, of course. But here we know the UN, I think, has never lost that many humanitarian workers in, I think, in such a short amount of time, or maybe just overall?
No, I think that
overall now?
It's the most in any recent conflict.
Yeah. So UN agencies have really been part of this conflict, I guess, more than, for example, last year with the war in Ukraine. And I guess just seeing their helplessness is really a striking thing. And I mean, it's just, you can really tell that they've lost their protection and they're totally desperate, and it's sad thing.
And it's it's as if, you know, that it's the humanitarian arm of the UN that's in Geneva, and they're still in Syria, they're still in Afghanistan, they're still in Yemen. Now they're trying in Gaza, Israel, OPT, Sudan, and you feel like they're being squeezed and squeezed and squeezed between the warring parties and the Security Council, that they will never agree. Nick, have you got a cheery story for us?
A cheery story, no.
Surprise.
But I guess, yes, Gaza obviously is tough billing for everybody. But it's been a year where we went from sort of Ukraine, we had the Turkish and Syrian earthquakes, as well as then the civil war in Sudan. And we still have this sort of persistent conflict in Ethiopia, and all the revelations about appalling atrocities that continue in Ethiopia despite the so-called end of the Tigray civil war. But I guess if I was to pick a story, I would shift from this sort of ecosystem of atrocities to accountability, upbeat. And we had this strange trial in Switzerland of this Belarusian former soldier, Yuri Harausky, who was part of a hit squad that took down 3 opposition leaders at a critical stage in essentially the consolidation of Lukashenko's extremely brutal authoritarian rule. And this was a critical stage in that. And he went on trial. And it was really an eye-opening case, which ended up with him not being convicted, but there is an appeal still to come. So that case hasn't gone away. And it was interesting because it was also kind of evidence of how universal jurisdiction cases are advancing in Europe. And so to all these people who are out there committing these atrocities, little Yuri Harausky, 44-year-old former sort of hitman, is perhaps a case that they might want to pay attention to. And there are other cases coming. I mean, we have also this year, the appeal court upheld a conviction against this Liberian warlord.
That's right. That was seen as quite a precedent setting.
Which was a very significant case, and he was convicted. He was originally charged and convicted of war crimes. On appeal, the federal court upgraded the charges to crimes against humanity, and he was convicted of that. He's gone away for 20 years. And we will be having in January a case against this former Gambian Ministry of Interior, the Gambian Ministry of Interior, who's being charged with crimes against humanity. And that's the highest ranking individual, state government individual ever tried under universal jurisdiction in Europe. Very interesting case. So something to look forward to there.
Yeah, that is going to be interesting. And it is, when you think of all the different times that we, here in Geneva, we report on the Human Rights Council and all of these different groups who have seen firsthand violations, they invest their hope in the Human Rights Council. And now maybe, okay, it's not a decision of the Human Rights Council, but the universal jurisdiction is maybe bringing some hope that if you come and you bring your evidence, eventually, maybe 20 years later, you will get some justice, which before, 10 years ago, we were not having cases like this.
No, we weren't. And it's a reminder also that, you know, at a time when there are all these question marks about what the ICC can and will do, and its funding and its political will, that there are other avenues of justice that are developing that can take people, put people in prison.
Yeah, and human rights defenders are becoming increasingly skilled at making use of them, which is actually quite heartening to see, I think. So I'm gonna tell you my standout story of the year, which unfortunately does go back to Israel, Gaza somewhat, but it's a wider reason that it stood out for me, and that's because I went and did a feature, quite an in-depth feature, about what the International Committee of the Red Cross does with hostages, in this case Gaza, how it works, tracing back to their work with prisoners of war, and so on. And the reason I did it was because there seemed to be a lot of, a kind way of saying it would be misunderstandings, but eventually misinformation. And as I was writing this story, I realized I did something very similar this time last year, but about Ukraine.
Yeah.
And the reason was that the ICRC, which is the guardian of the Geneva Conventions, impartial, neutral, very tight-lipped, was getting vilified on social media, first in Ukraine and then Israel, Gaza in particular. Why haven't you visited them? You're just an Uber driver. And I was trying to explain to one or two people, skeptical, oh, they should have done more, you know. You imagine if you don't have permission, also, actually, they didn't know where the hostages were, but if you don't have permission to visit these hostages, you drive in, you try to find them, possibly the IDF follows you, and everybody gets killed. This is the kind of framework in which they're working, and it seemed a bit sad to me that in the end 100 hostages did get out, and the only, as far as I can see, you guys can disagree, but I was thinking, is there another organization in the world that could drive into a place like that unarmed and bring them back safely? I don't know.
They have come under fire, though, in this conflict, so they haven't been completely immune. But I think you're right. I think they are the only organization that, at least I can think of, that can do that job. Yeah, who else could drive into Gaza like that with and hope to be safe?
And as they did also in Yemen. I mean, the cases they did there.
Yes.
And all the people
They've done it recently in Sudan, I think, as well.
Probably.
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, what I was asking myself was, as we see the world, increasingly wealthy countries, we're kind of getting increasingly tribal. And there's a lot of stuff on social media which people believe without much actual, validation, proof. Are we risking, with all of these, not just the ICRC, but a lot of the UN as well, throwing the baby out with the bathwater of we're just doubting all the time these fundamental principles? I mean, why do we think was so much criticism directed at the ICRC that they had failed, as they said, to visit the hostages? Where is that coming from?
Well, I think it's coming just from sheer frustration on the part of families of victims, which is, in some ways extremely understandable, but it's also extremely regrettable that they demonize the institution that may be able to help them. Because ultimately those institutions, or the ICRC, and to a certain extent also the UN, are entirely dependent on the governments that they're trying to engage with. And if, the ICRC are unable to get into Olenivka to identify what happened in that particular instance where a large number of people got blown up in very questionable circumstances, it's not the failure of the ICRC. And similarly, you cannot expect the ICRC, they don't have a stick to wield to beat Hamas over the head and say, take us to the hostages. It's a situation entirely in the gift of Hamas.
No, I mean, they work with we could at one point be trying to visit you.
Yeah.
That's their only stick, is to say, you've got a brother maybe banged up in Israel. We can visit him.
Yeah.
Let us visit the hostages. And that is what they do, but, it doesn't always work. I was wondering, Dorian, I'll ask you, because we've been working almost a bit together on this, all the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and 75 years. And it's a bit linked that we have the Geneva Conventions, they're fundamental core principles, so theoretically is the Universal Declaration. And yet, all of these things seem weaker. People have doubts, or they don't understand how they're supposed to work, or even what their own responsibility is to uphold them. I'm just wondering whether, as we get further and further away from that point, it's easier to doubt these things or say that they're not fit for the 21st century.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, as time passes, it becomes easier to question things because we can just say they're so ancient, or are they still relevant today? But I think, and I mean, we understand why these principles are being challenged as well. It's, of course, to suit the interests of people that criticize them. So, for example, authoritarian governments aren't going to be too happy with all human rights being equal. And
they're a bit of a nuisance, aren't they? Here
they are a bit of a nuisance, but I think also, it's also up to, I guess it's probably fair to say a lot of it has been shaped by the West, this post-war architecture. But then I think, so it's been questioned by other countries, but then I think it's also up to Western countries to really uphold these principles. And here I think we've seen, I mean, it's true, a lot of double standards and countries not following through with what they preach. And I guess that's part of the problem.
But what is the alternative? Because that happened. All of these institutions, all of these rules were created at a moment of collective reckoning with the world that we simply can't reproduce. There will never be unity, especially in this era of, I'm going to use the P word, polarization. You're never going to be able to rewrite them in a way and get everyone on board. So that's what we've got. But I think next year will be interesting because there will be an attempt, and Geneva will be part of that, to rewrite some rules at least, and that's in the world of technology and health. And you could argue that after the pandemic, this is a collective moment where we could actually rewrite some of the health rules. So that's going to be a really interesting one for next year to see whether countries can rally around. I don't know what you guys are hearing, but the diplomats I'm speaking to aren't
the
overly
pandemic treaty you're talking about.
Optimistic, exactly.
Because we come back to sovereignty,
Yeah.
and the governments do not want to commit themselves to independent scrutiny, which is at the heart of a lot of the international rise around the origins of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And we still seem to be stuck in that rut. But I agree, it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out in the coming year. And of course, in 2024, Gaza will be with us, and it will come back to the Human Rights Council. The Commission of Inquiry will be delivering their first report to the Human Rights Council. Their first formal report will be in June, and that will be a reference point on kind of the assessment of how the conduct of hostilities by both sides in this war.
That's not going to make very pretty reading, I don't think.
I don't think so, no.
Coming back to, you talked about the lack of optimism you have about the pandemic treaty. And again, we're at this, if you can't unite after a pandemic that disrupted every single life on this planet, we got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions because of the Second World War. But we can't unite around this. And yet, I have heard hopeful voices, I'm coming back to Gaza, saying that this cataclysm in Israel-Gaza might force big powers in the Arab world or in the United States to put their eye back on the ball. Has anybody got any optimism about that?
I'm not feeling too optimistic,
No.
personally. In fact, analysts are saying that as Gaza starts to slip down the news agenda, then demand for accountability might also slip down the agenda. I'm not trying to be negative, but that is one scenario. I don't know if you're feeling it, but I can start to feel it slipping.
People are exhausted. I have so many friends who say to me now, I'm just not watching the news anymore, which concerns me because when you watch the news, all of these violent events have a context. And if people are never watching the news or not paying any attention to their history, we will never get a solution. People don't even know where to begin. You're nodding, Dorian.
Well, for example, if you're talking about are people getting informed, I think this is also a question for younger people. I'm not so sure. I guess social media is changing things a lot, and it's just harder and harder to get good information. It's easier to just keep looking at the same thing, and then you're just going into a hole where you're just never looking at anything else. And so I think it's also up to the media to be able to explain these things to younger people. But
we try.
I think one of the things I found a bit depressing, apart from the sheer horror of everything that was happening, with a number of official Israeli voices invoking Britain's bombing of Dresden as a kind of parallel that somehow justified the bombardment of Gaza. And the whole point of international humanitarian law and the rules of war that have been developed since is to avoid us going back to that.
Yeah,
So,
no more Dresden, no more Tokyo. No, I mean,
Yeah.
that's part of it.
and
That's a shame.
we need to see a greater sort of recommitment to these principles, and I think 2024 is going to be a very interesting test of that. And it may slip down the news agenda, but we still have potentially months of conflict, and we then have the whole issue of post-conflict. All this talk about the two-state solution and the firm commitments that we've had from the United States, from the UK, and all the European governments saying two-state solution, we've now got to do something about it. Well, 2024 is going to really see where the rubber hits the road on that one.
Yeah, but half of them are going to be focused on their own election campaigns.
Indeed.
The US and the United Kingdom. And I was wondering again about that. We were talking about social media. Okay, the elections in the US and UK are not entirely Geneva's business, but they will be the UN's business, what happens in these countries. I'm wondering whether this is the first year we're going to see real, serious manipulation AI in election campaigns.
I think it's already happening, isn't
You
it?
know? What do you think, Dorian?
I mean, I'm wondering too, is it going to be, I mean, certainly it's going to be even more dangerous, I guess, than if we think about the US presidency. It's going to be even more dangerous than in 2020. We've all seen, I think, this year the progresses of AI with ChatGPT. So, I mean, we can all worry about that for sure.
Yeah. Maybe
Yes, and one result in that American election could eclipse an awful lot of what we're talking about.
I think it could eclipse virtually everything. I mean, it's a long time till November. I mean, let's enjoy ourselves till then.
And how are we going to regulate AI? I mean, that's a big question for the UN. I mean, the UN wants a piece of it, but everyone will say they're behind the curve. And actually, the agencies are kind of fighting amongst themselves, as far as I can see.
Oh,
it's a bit
surprise,
of a turf war.
surprise. I mean, they do that. It's unfortunate. It's the secret of the United Nations that these different, very well-meaning agencies sometimes fight with each other about whose responsibility it is to do something that everybody says they want to do. But, yeah. Well, what time are we at? Just a bit. We haven't actually, this is the other big elephant in the room. We were talking about conflict. We had COP. I mean, this time last year, we did actually talk, I think, quite a lot about climate change. We've certainly in the past on Inside Geneva talked about how the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, when he started this thankless job, wanted climate change to be his legacy. He wanted to do something about it. Are we going anywhere?
I mean, are we going anywhere? I think, poor Antonio Guterres has had a lot on his plate besides climate. Yeah. So,
pandemic,
I mean,
wars, 55 of them.
Yes, and I think, he is always, saying that this is sort of this existential threat on top of all of the other threats. But, have we been achieving a lot? I'm not sure. I think COP28 did end, from what I understood, on a bit more of a positive note than some feared it would, perhaps.
I think they did actually mention that it might, at some point in an indeterminate future, be a good idea to transition away from fossil fuels. It took an extra 36 hours, I think, to achieve that. What about you, Emma?
I know that it's a priority for Guterres, but I think with so many conflicts around the world, I think it's hard for the UN to make that the top priority. I mean, it's an undercurrent all the time, but is it the one that they can focus on above all others? let's see this year. It depends what happens. If there's another huge climate disaster, then obviously that will give it more.
Isn't
impetus.
it just so human nature? We need something really bad to happen, and then we might do something about it.
It's quite extraordinary that we've had to go through 28 COPs to get to one which says, actually, fossil fuels are a bad idea.
You know, the scientists have been telling us that for a really long time, and now we think we'll write it down just so we remember it. I mean, yeah.
In a COP hosted by a state, of course, which is part and parcel of the whole fossil fuel industry.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
the ironies of that whole event.
I mean, on the one hand, you can't, it's a United Nations thing, you can't really say, oh, there's going to be part of the world we'll never have our climate change summit in. That would be, the UN can't do that, just like it can't really stop Iran chairing the Human Rights Council. You know, it's an administrative kind of thing.
But it's interesting also, I mean, at a time when we're hearing so much talk about polarization between global north and south, between the rich and the poor, and the greater stress on inequalities, which is all, you know, eminently justifiable, that in this particular COP, some of the loudest voices against, you know, reference to fossil fuels were developing countries that depend on fossil fuels for their future development prospects, and then that pits them against the Maldives and the South, you know, Pacific island states that are looking at a rather existential threat of being flooded.
Well, maybe that was one positive thing. There was this extra money for developing countries to transition away.
Yeah.
That was agreed right at the start.
A good start.
Something.
That was a good start. Yeah.
We are almost at the end. As I warned, I think at the beginning, this was not necessarily going to be the most cheerful and optimistic, because 23, we have to be honest, it's not been a fantastic year. It's, you know, for many, many people in far more challenging places than Geneva. But I will ask each of you to maybe, just if we look ahead to 2024, what are you going to be looking at? What's a story you think, I do really want to have a hard look at that? We'll reverse the way around. I'll start with you, Nick.
Good question. Well, we have coming up in January an issue that's been rather eclipsed by all the horrors of the past year, and that is China's UPR.
That's right, the Universal Periodic Review.
The Universal Periodic Review, when we will see how this is its first real international scrutiny since the Office of the High Commissioner produced a report saying that China had, you know, committed crimes against humanity in its treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. It's going to be a test also partly of how does the UN summarize that? And we haven't heard very much from Volker Turk on this issue at all since he became the High Commissioner. And he said at the outset, I own this report, I'm going to follow up. We've seen nothing. So it's going to be very interesting to see, first of all, how China tries to get past this report in its presentation, the kind of recommendations that it will take on board. Are they going to be sort of the dog whistles from other authoritarian states saying, you know, we like the way you're encouraging sort of intercultural cooperation in your minority states, and seeing how the UN also presents this issue and follows up on this. So that's one issue. And we've just had a global humanitarian appeal.
Reduced from last year, although the needs are greater.
Last year to 46 billion. And it'll be interesting to see, you know, how this unfolds and how much of the 46 billion they've asked for. I mean, this is a multilateral system that is absolutely sort of falling apart under the strain of all the extreme events it's having to deal with, and, you know, cutting back what in the past would have been considered minimal assistance to people in the extremes of human suffering. You know, the world hasn't responded terribly well so far to this. I mean, China gives less than $1 million to the surf, which is
the UN's emergency
to the UN Emergency
Fund.
That's less than half Iceland. This is the world's second biggest economy can't give more than $1 million. Saudi Arabia, which offers a footballer a contract of more than $1 billion, didn't deliver $1 million to the surf this year.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
there's...
what are people's priorities here?
Dorian, your stories you're going to be watching?
I think I also want to. I also want to look at maybe forgotten humanitarian crisis a bit more because I guess here in Geneva we do hear a lot about them because we're still getting briefed on them quite regularly. Unfortunately, it doesn't always get into the news because there are those other big crises we're talking about. But even, I was recently just looking at the figures of the biggest humanitarian crisis, and it's Syria, it's Ethiopia, it's
Yemen probably still.
It might be Yemen as well. Afghanistan is up there, so Ukraine comes in fourth, and they're all a third funded now when we're in mid-December, and yeah, and it's awful. So I think if we can shine a bit of a spotlight on that, that would be probably a good thing to do. Because
we need to have a word with our editors to actually take these stories.
Right.
We're always competing. There's always a new war making the headlines, and the other ones slip off the agenda. What about you?
No, well, I agree with both of you that it's a huge question, the humanitarian system, almost existential, I'd say, and I'm not the only one to say that. I think that Grandi has said that, and
The head of the UN Refugee Agency.
the head of yes, indeed, that we can't continue like this, and so that's going to be a big one. And of course, at a time when two of the biggest donors, the U.S. and Germany, there are big question marks over what they can give next year. Refugees as well, mentioning Grandi, we just had the Global Refugee Forum, and it was a good outcome, and it was a very positive dynamic. But there is a very strong narrative amongst Western countries especially that they need to tighten their borders. And this is going to be a very big one next year and going forward with more and more displacement from climate. Of course, they're not officially refugees under the convention, but that's going to be a big tension, I think, going forward next year. Maybe one word for the WTO. It'll be an important year for their relevance. There's obviously the ministerial conference in February. They're trying to fix their top appeals court. And if they can't, then at least its job as a watchdog will be dealt a big blow. That's one to watch.
Yeah, that's been bubbling along for a while. That if they can't solve disputes and watch when a country is overstepping the mark with unfair trade, that's going to... these are also sources of conflict, of which we really have enough at the moment. Well, just for me, I do want to do something more about Afghanistan. We heard this term gender apartheid used in the second half of this year. There's a big dilemma, I think, for UN agencies in Afghanistan, how far they can work with the Taliban when this is going on. Ukraine, we've hardly talked about. We hardly talked about. I think it is going to slip down the agenda, and I'm wondering if it's going to be descend into one of these frozen conflicts which will suck masses of funding and energy from the humanitarian organisations, like they've been doing in Afghanistan for decades, Yemen, Syria, and we will come full circle this time next year and they will have another appeal. They will say 2023, they only got 25% of what they asked for. They'll cut funding again. We were talking this morning about how the World Food Programme has cut food rations in Afghanistan to very vulnerable people. And they're going to end on a really, and in Yemen, a really pessimistic note, which every humanitarian agency will tell you that poverty and vulnerability leads to tensions, leads to conflict, leads to poverty and vulnerability, and somehow we don't learn. That is 2023 for you. My thanks to Nick, Dorian, and Emma. Next time on Inside Geneva, we talked a bit about the ICRC's role with prisoners of war and hostages. We have an in-depth interview with their director for the Middle East. So tune in for that. That's the 9th of January.